The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is... This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Mike Baker, the former CIA officer, security expert, and author. Your career began in the United States Marine Corps in 1979, where you served as an infantry officer. From there, you joined the Central Intelligence Agency and spent over 15 years working predominantly in covert operations and counterterrorism. You frequently appear on CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC to discuss intelligence and security issues, while you've also served as a consultant and advisor to various government agencies, including the Department of Defense and the Department of Homeland Security. You're the host of the popular TV series Black Files Declassified, where you uncover the truth behind some of the world's most intriguing secret government operations. And your latest book, Company Rules, or Everything I Know About Business I Learned from the CIA, outlines the 9 principles you learned at the agency that can help any business to grow and prosper. Mike, welcome to London Real.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. But now I've got to make one quick correction to that fantastic introduction. One is that I was never in the Marine Corps. I don't think I was tough enough to be taken into the Marine Corps, frankly. So no military service. I went straight into the CIA, into the Operations Directorate, and spent the better part of 2 decades overseas with them. But God bless the U.S. Marines.
Yeah, that's for sure. Well, good, because I got a couple questions today about all of your experience with CIA. I loved your various episodes on Rogan, and you kind of telling people they get to see on the news what's going on in the world, and you can always tell people what's actually going on. And this week I was preparing for this show, Mike, and all of a sudden a headline flashed across my computer, and it was on the Wall Street Journal. And it showed something that was happening in the South China Sea. And I thought of you immediately. And I think it was this little reef area that in 2006 was literally just a bunch of rocks. And then when you look at pictures of it now, it's been built up into this, what looks like a highly well-made military base, complete with like a runway. I don't know how they filled it on there. Looks like they built up and created land from this reef. And now China's got this outpost there, and they did that, I guess, under everyone's nose. And I don't know if you've seen these pictures. We're actually flashing a few on screen here, but I'm just wondering, when you see something like that, what does that tell us about U.S.-China relations, about what's happening in that area, maybe even about this long-term mindset of the Chinese, and what were your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I think you pointed to the most important thing, which is the long-term mindset of the Chinese. So when you start talking about the Chinese regime under Xi, right? We're not talking about the Chinese population or their fantastic history and culture and all the rest of it. We're talking about the Chinese regime and led by Xi, who is now their longest serving leader going back generations. You have to understand that they view things differently than the West does, right? The US, the UK, the EU, everybody's got attention deficit disorder. So we all, chasing the next, shiny object, like a bunch of raccoons. And the Chinese look way down the road, right? Their view is much, much longer than ours. And that's the first thing you have to understand. The next point that you raise is they have been doing this literally, as you pointed out, literally creating small islands for military purposes in the South China Sea out of almost nothing, the barest of reefs, and then building those sites up. And why are they doing that? In part, they're doing it because for decades they've been frustrated that the U.S. has been essentially responsible for the open seas in South China Sea. So in their mind, the U.S. in particular and our allies have been playing in their neighborhood. They consider that their turf and have for a long time. So they've been upset ever since essentially World War II that, we've had a presence there. And their goal is essentially to get to the top of the food chain. And they're very pragmatic about how they're going to get there. For decades, they've jump-started their industry by just hoovering up economic intelligence and basically espionage, stealing information, not just from the US and the UK and our allies, everyone. It doesn't matter who. Hoover it all up. And then eventually, because they've got the resources and the motivation and that long view, they find whatever is going to benefit the regime, the pseudo-independent, but they're mostly state-owned companies. And that's what they've been doing to accelerate their progress towards what they believe is their rightful place eventually at the top of the heap.
Right. All right. Well, look, I want to talk more about that. Let's talk the location first. So South China Sea, like you said, after World War II, the U.S. Navy has pretty much owned, controlled, and provided safety to all shipping routes in all the seas around the world. And I remember reading an article by some guys at a company that used to be called Stratfor, I think out of Texas, where it basically said the Navy does it all for free. They give you this safety, which is this amazing commodity. But in return for that, I guess we run the seas. And it's this weird implicit agreement that all these countries had that, yeah, we patrol them, that we provide the safety. But China doesn't like us controlling the seas in their backyard. And I'm guessing they also potentially don't like Taiwan, which is right in the middle of those seas. And so why is that area ultra important with, again, potentially all this semiconductor knowledge in Taiwan?
Right. Yeah. There's a lot to unpack there, but essentially, if you imagine from their perspective that we essentially are in their sandbox, right?
We are, right?
Yeah. And that's how they view it. It's their turf. And that's the same way they view Taiwan. So moving on to Taiwan, there is no separation. It's not as if they look at Taiwan and say, it's an independent nation and, but one day we'd like to have it. They look at it and think, you're an errant child, who threw a fit and ran away. And now we're bringing you back into the fold. And that timeline, I would argue, has been accelerated by Xi. I don't think Xi has any intention of stepping down eventually, whenever he does leave office, without having brought Taiwan back into their control, into their fold. And so I think you can look when you say, well, what's the timeline for them taking action on Taiwan? I think you can look at it in more, immediate terms and just say, well, what does Xi's health look like? What does Xi's tenure look like? Because I just don't see him fading off into the sunset without him accomplishing what he considers to be a primary goal.
Interesting. All right. So all of these are parts of them trying to reclaim that territory back, potentially bring Taiwan back in the fray. How is their Navy, by the way?
Larger than the U.S. Navy at this point, just in sheer number of vessels, of ships. And they've been, their aggressiveness in building out their military over the past decade, longer, but particularly over the past decade, has been impressive, right? They, and again, with this single-minded notion that, it's not as if they're preparing for a hot war necessarily, but they are looking at the point where, from their perspective, the U.S. is a declining nation. That's kind of how Xi and his cronies imagine this and view this. And so they want to be prepared for that day when, again, they take that last step on the ladder and get to the top of the food chain. So we have never really dealt with China in a particularly pragmatic manner. We've always, from a business perspective, we've always imagined it to be this holy grail, right? Every company chases business in China because, oh my God, I want that market. And so a lot of those businesses are willing to look the other way when it comes to all the human rights abuses and the fact that there's no rule of law. And so, but from a foreign policy perspective, I'd argue we've never really gotten it, spot on when it comes to China, and the current U.S. administration looks at them and thinks, well, they're a competitor, but they're not really. China views us as an adversary, and we should be doing the same thing. Again, not because we want the missiles to fly, God forbid, we definitely don't want that. But we have to understand how they think. We have to understand what their perception is and why they do the things they do.
And so just to cut to the chase, Mike, how does this play out in your mind in the next 50 years? Like who wins, or what are the important decisions that need to be made? And then if there is a victory, how does that change the world?
Well, look, I know that, the U.S. takes a lot of heat, and I'm a dual citizen, U.S. and U.K. citizen. I know the U.S. takes a lot of heat for its actions around the world. But I spent the better part of my childhood and my adult life overseas in a lot of different environments. And while the U.S. under various administrations at times makes mistakes, there is a self-correcting effort. There's an effort to try to do the right thing. And I know it sounds like I'm just making shit up, or it's through rose-colored glasses or whatever, but there is a sense that they want to do the right thing, whichever administration's in place. Sometimes that doesn't work out, but then there's a correction. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, if you imagine that that's not the U.S. at the top trying to do the right thing, or trying to establish and maintain peace in various parts of the world, or pursue democracy, sometimes that doesn't work out, then it's China. And if China gets to the top of the food chain, then I don't think they're going to be quite as generous as a regime goes. And I don't think that's going to be their first concern. The Xi regime, and every Chinese regime, acts instinctively and definitively in their own best interests all the time, right? They never look at this like it's a community of nations. They always look at everything, foreign policy, economics, security, in their own best interests, right? Every nation does to some degree. The U.S. certainly does, but the U.S. is always the one that apologizes for it, it seems, which is an odd thing. Anyway, I don't want to disappear down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, like I was about to say, a lot of people would look at U.S. foreign policy and everything since Bretton Woods and say the petrodollar, and the U.S. would say, well, the U.S. is looking out for themselves. But I think I know what you mean. Maybe there's a slightly different spirit there when you look at those things. Let me ask you about a few things. I want to ask you about the spy balloons. I want to ask you about the Belt and Road Initiative, because maybe not everyone knows what that is. And then, like you said, the espionage, the stuff with Huawei and all these other things. Maybe just bring everybody up to speed with some of the things that China is doing globally that maybe we should keep our eye on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the spy balloon situation was an interesting incident, but it's a good example of kind of how they view the world, right? I mean, everything is of interest to them, and it's of interest to them because it may benefit their economy, it may benefit their regime, and so when we talk about economic espionage, the number one perpetrator of that is China, and has been for generations. Right? There's just no argument there. I mean, you can say, well, every country does it, but no, not every country does it to that degree, to the resources that they do. Whether they're taking information via just academic institutions, whether they're doing it through attendance at conferences, whether they're straight up using human and recruitment of sources overseas to steal information, whether it's signals intercepts or it's capturing images, as with the spy balloon. They use every trick in the book, and they've been very aggressive and continue to be very aggressive in how they do this. And that's important to understand, because we're talking about almost an unquantifiable amount in terms of losses to the UK, to the US, to the EU, to the West, in terms of lost opportunity, lost research and development, lost jobs over the years. So, I could spend all day banging on about, the damage done by the Chinese regime. And again, people always say, right, you can't, no, I'm not talking about the population of the people, right? I've spent a lot of time over there, and I have a great deal of respect for the population, the culture, the history. But it's the regime, and nobody has locked down that country more than Xi over the recent past. What he's done in terms of squashing democracy, the abuse of the Uyghurs and others, the kind of squashing the last remnants of a rule of law, has been pretty impressive, building up his internal security services. So it's an impressive effort that he's been making, in part to secure the Communist Party's power for the long-term foreseeable future. Anyway,
just on Xi real quick, are you surprised he's gone that way? Because they've had so much success opening themselves up in a quasi-capitalistic way. I mean, you could argue that's why it grew so much. Maybe you go back to Mao for that, or his predecessor. But when you see him turning, or when I see a lot of this, I'm wondering, is he making the right decision, or was this the inevitable conclusion of consolidating power, kind of Putin style, that any regime would do?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. I think there's a lot to be said for that latter point that you just made. It may be sort of the inevitable path that is always taken by that type of government. But I think in part it was also driven by some concern. Look, Xi's no different than Putin in the sense that the one thing that they worry about is losing control of the population, right? And in China, there was this sense, I believe, growing within the regime that maybe their population had hit that ceiling. There was no more advancement, right? There was no more place for them to go. This illusion that they had created about, oh, well, look at us, everyone's becoming middle class and upper class, and it's not going to happen, right? You got massive ghost towns made up of just spoof construction projects, right? Just to keep people busy, right? With no occupation, nothing in them. And so I think there was concern growing, which then means, okay, we've got to deal with the public in a different way. Maybe that means we've got to drop the hammer and tighten the screws a little bit on well, I'm just mixing my metaphors, on the population. So I think there was that element as well. So it's not surprising. Xi is a very smart individual, and he so far has done a remarkable job of maintaining a very tight control over the Communist Party, the military, the intel services, and the population.
Yeah. Let me ask you something, Mike. The technology, the state it is today, I'm just wanting your opinion. They've got the 5G, they got the face recognition. Obviously, they locked down the WeChat and the monetary system. We've heard about their CBDC that they've rolled out to 80, 100 million people. And from what I've heard of people that are pretty deep in the CBDC game is that it's pretty advanced and pretty oppressive. Just curious, from your point of view, could Xi have done this, in 2000? Or does it require this force multiplying technology to be able to do what he's doing, or maybe even the threat that technology could exist to the population to do it? Or am I totally off?
No, I think you're spot on. I think obviously it's just to keep throwing out trite phrases, it's a double-edged sword. There's an upside and a downside to technology when you're talking about security, right? The ability for the population to move information or to acquire information, right, has increased. But the ability to monitor, to surveil, right, the population has exponentially increased, right? So the ability to gather information on people. I mean, if the average person out there, whether it's in London or Washington, D.C. or Melbourne or wherever it may be, if they knew how much data was available, right? And I'm not just talking to governments, right? The corporations are much more efficient at this, right? They're much better at this. So governments, for the most part, can't organize panic in a doomed submarine. So I think it's the companies that you tend to have to worry about in terms of the collection. But if people knew just how much of their information was accessible, they'd be shocked.
I saw some poor reports recently talking about how, law enforcement and government can get specific intel on a specific person and a specific phone number, and that's fairly easy to get and has been done. I don't know if there was some stuff that came out about the FBI about that. Facial recognition technology, is the public are we oblivious to how far that's really advanced? And I know in China, or at least I've heard in China, that it's, everybody is being tracked by facial recognition pretty much everywhere. And it's all woven into, the social score, the CBDCs, which really controls the population. What can you tell us about that tech?
Yeah, it's really advanced over the past even half dozen years. Its capabilities are remarkable. I mean, here in the U.S.,
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.